everyone. How are we today? I'm going to do chapter 13 today of The Reaper and the Scribe. Hope everybody's feeling okay and keeping themselves entertained, like us. Thanks for coming today. Chapter 13. In the 19th century, Alicia's and Jamie's workday had begun. Alicia's journey was going to be slightly longer today, as they were going on what Albert called the Abbey Hall. This journey would take them from Thwaitgate to Kirkstall. As Toby began to pull the fully laden barge, Alicia was the first at the tiller, covered in coal dust, coughing and wiping her eyes. It was yet another cold but clear day, clear in as there were no clouds in the sky, but the smoke from the chimneys had already begun darkening the day. Alicia had taken to steering the boat like a duck to water. Albert had a bit more time on his overworked hands, so he pulled out his squeeze box and played a little tune. Without thinking what she was doing, Alicia was at first humming along, and then singing the words of the song as he was playing. "Now, how do you know them words, Alicia? That is a song that I made up and used to sing to the young uns at bedtime." "I don't know, Albert. I just know the song." "Yes, my father used to sing it to me. I had forgotten he used to do that," Alicia replied. So, with young James out in the front with Toby and Doris below deck, having 40 winks, the happy little canal boat Lightning was pulled along towards Kirkstall, with its crew singing. When Jamie arrived at work that morning, he called in to see the man in charge of the steam engine. This had become a routine, as he had struck up a friendship with him. He was also learning from this man about what he listens for, because apart from the oiling, that was the most important thing about running a steam engine. His friend would tell him about the different hisses and groans, but when he heard something strange, he would immediately attend to it. Jamie took in every single word from this man from the distant past. The morning went quite smoothly. No kung fu, just a nice steaming pot of tea when he arrived, and a day doing bits and bobs. Jamie asked the foreman what the cellar was actually used for. "Inquisitive little booker, aren't you, lad?" said the foreman. "Yes, sir. I want to do well here," replied Jamie. "Seems to me tha's a quick learner. The way you dealt with those young lads yesterday was quite impressive." "Oh, I hope you won't hold that against me, sir." "Huh! Of course not. I can't be doing with loafers, softies, or telltales. You handled yourself correctly, in my opinion, and no more needs to be said on the subject." "Pardon, sir, but the cellar?" "Ah, yes. We tried to use it for casting. The furnace is still down there. It's bricked up behind the opposite wall to the one you fixed. All the moldings are still under the stone flags. We couldn't get it to work proper, so the engineer had it all covered up until later. He then found he could have it done elsewhere, and it was cheaper too, so it just all stayed buried, so to speak." "Thank you very much, sir," said Jamie, trying to keep his enthusiasm under wraps. This, to Jamie, was like finding the Holy Grail. All the moldings for the parts he needed were still probably lying in pristine condition under the floor in the 21st century. He began to think that this strange trip was not only for his sister and his 19th century counterpart. It held wonderful repercussions for himself, too. Knowing this, he wondered, what possibly could Alice gain from this? After all, she was living the life of his sister, poor thing. With the knowledge of his new find tucked away in his memory for another time, he set about his daily task of making a new life for John Watson. Jamie's up until now spoilt, waste of space sister was singing along to Albert's squeeze box as she safely negotiated Albert's pride and joy through the lock and onto the part of the river air that ran past her 21st century penthouse. Looking up, she pointed it out to Albert. "Look, Albert, that's where I live." "You live in a mucky old factory?" was his surprised answer. "No, that other Alicia wouldn't know what a mucky factory was. I own the entire top floor of that building. It has been turned into luxury apartments." She then corrected herself and said, "places to live." "There must be a lot of you for you to fill all that space," replied Albert. "No, Albert, just me," she answered, hanging her head in shame. "It's good that there is housing for everyone in your day, lass, if that is an abode for one." Feeling even more ashamed, she said, "Albert, there are whole families that don't have anywhere to live, and we have young people living on the streets in boxes." "I can't see the sense in that, Alicia. If there's enough room for one person to live in a space that 12 families could live in, why isn't there enough housing for everyone else?" "Because of people like me, wanting more and more, and not giving a shit about people's needs. My time is all about wanting stuff, and wanting it now. I'm ashamed to be a part of it. I wish I could stay here." "Now then, lass, we'll have a bit less profanity. What's this about staying here? How can you change anything by staying here? You wouldn't want to condemn my Alice to your life, would you?" More and more, Alicia was discovering new things about herself and realizing what a parasite she really was. The words, "condemn Alice to your life," rang out loud and clear. "You are absolutely right. No, I wouldn't want to condemn poor Alice to my life. Things do need to change when I get back. I'm going to be a very busy girl, and a whole lot of people aren't going to like it." Albert nodded his head and gave one of his knowing smiles as the barge sailed past the building, with Toby pulling them on through Leeds and out towards Kirkstall. On arriving at the coal stage in between Kirkstall and Horsforth, Toby was pulled to a halt by young James, and Alicia leapt off the stern with the rope. She quickly wrapped it around the mooring tie, holding on to the end of it. The rope tightened, and 3 turns around the peg took the strain, with the fully laden barge coming to a stop. Running up to the bow, she shouted to Albert to throw her the bow rope, and she repeated her actions at the mooring of the bow, tying the barge up quickly and skillfully. It wasn't long before Albert and Alicia were hard at work, moving the coal from the bow hold. Alicia wiped the cold, dust-soaked sweat from her brow and said, "At least I didn't waste my time at the gym. It has certainly prepared me for this." "Who's this Jim?" asked Albert. Alicia laughed and said, "The gymnasium is a place where you work your muscles to get fit." "Hard work does that," replied Albert. "Yes, it does, but in my time it's a leisure activity. You walk on a treadmill and you lift weights to tone your muscles." Albert shook his head, saying, "I can't believe you still subject the orphan children to that." "No, Albert, workhouses are long gone. We do it for pleasure, to keep us fit," answered Alicia. "What an upside-down world you live in. I'm glad I will never see it," said Albert, still shaking his head. With that, the dusty, hard-working couple returned to their task. It wasn't too long before once again the two of them were finished, and Toby was pulling them back down the Leeds and Liverpool Canal to Leeds Center, and mooring near Leeds Bridge. "Jamie won't have such a long walk when he finishes work," observed Alicia. "No, lass, he'll be back soon." "I've been thinking, Albert." "Oh, dear." "After seeing me," pardon me, guys, he's snoring. "I've been thinking, Albert, after seeing me work with you this week, are you more encouraged to let Alice have a go?" "Do you mean doing John's work?" "Yes. I think she would love it, and you won't be short-handed when John is working and bringing in a wage." "I don't think it has ever been done." "What will people say?" said Albert. "They all think I'm Alice, and nobody has batted an eyelid." You're right there, lass. If Alice is up for it, I'll give it a go. Mind I'll be left high and dry if she finds a suitor." Alicia thought for a moment, then said, "That won't happen. I don't know why I say that, but it won't. Maybe young Freddy Chambers will be the only one she'll meet, because, to be honest, apart from saying she wants to meet a gentleman, it's never gone any further than that. And there won't be much chance of finding a gentleman looking like you do now, will there?" Alicia looked down at her coal dust-covered dress and said, "You're right there, Albert." She looked all around and saw there was nobody about. Seeing the coast was clear, she pulled her dress off over her head, taking with it her long vest, and gave both garments a vigorous shaking, removing the dust. She hadn't given a thought to the fact she was standing there quite naked in front of Albert, but when she turned towards him, in all her youthful beauty, he was busying himself whittling a piece of wood with his penknife, without a care for her nakedness. Alicia replaced her clothes and went over to Albert, kissing him on his cheek. This brought a smile to his face, and he asked, "What was that for?" "For being who you are. The men from my time could learn much from you, Albert. You are a truly great man." "Well, lass, I don't know about that, but thank you anyway," said Albert, his rough cheeks showing a bit of a flush. Time was passing by for Jamie at work, as he was watching a piston being fitted into a cylinder. He was making notes of everything he was seeing, but not letting anyone see him doing it. As soon as he has filled his own notebook with relevant information, it was going into the wall with the rest of his treasure. Jamie was in his element in this environment, and was sure John would take to it too. The engineer liked him, the foreman liked him, and the troublesome young workers would leave him alone for sure. Everything was beginning to add up, and the only fly in the ointment, so to speak, was Freddy Chambers. Why had his name cropped up? A steam horn blasted outside, signifying the end of the working day, and Jamie was wondering what Doris had made for supper. He rushed out of the factory and down to the canal, where, to his surprise, Toby was munching on his nose bag. "Hello, you two," said Jamie when he saw Albert and Alicia. Alicia ran to him and gave him a hug. "I'm forever in your debt, Albert, for what you have done for my sister. The debt is paid with what you have done for my John," Albert answered. The warming glow of fire and candlelight escaped from the cabin, and with it came a waft of Doris's stew. "Come and get it, you lot," said Doris. Like a flash, all three of them were downstairs, enjoying Doris's simple but beautiful stew. In the 21st century, night had also drawn in, and John Watson had had the best day of his life. He had spent the day looking at engines from the 1810 to the 1870s period, and showed no interest in any of the locomotives that most had come to see. After his day with John, Bob Jones said, "I gotta say, John, you have been the most interested person I have ever shown these types of locomotives to. You've also been the strangest, not wanting to see the Mallard, the Flying Scotsman, or the Royal Coaches." "What are they?" asked John. "What do you mean? These are the most famous railway-related items in the world," exclaimed Bob. "But I've never heard of them. I'm sorry." Bob Jones once again just scratched his head and said, "Did you get all the information you needed on the lesser-known locos that you wanted?" "I have, sir, but you are wrong about these engines. Their fame has even reached us on the canal. I was only talking to my father about that very thing a few days ago. You mark my words, Mr. Jones, these things will take over the canals, because they can deliver coal much quicker." "I'm sure you're right," said Bob Jones, hardly believing his own ears. "Well, then, let's take you back to the entrance to meet Freddy and your sister." Freddy and Alice were on their way back, enjoying another romantic ride in a beautiful horse-drawn coach. Alice's day had been perfect. The shops, the meal, and for the first time in her life, visiting York in all its splendor. "I have had the best time ever. Thank you," said Alice. "I have too. Look, there's John with Bob." As the chestnut-colored mare was brought to a halt outside the National Railway Museum, Freddy said, "Hop in, John." Looking at his friend's puzzled face, he continued, "Is everything okay, Bob?" "Everything was fine. I'm over in Leeds in a few days. I'll call in and see you and Jamie to see how the world's greatest railway is coming along. I shall look forward to it, and thank you for today." With that, the driver tapped the horse with the reins and said, "Where to now, sir?" "The station, please. I think I have two very tired people here." In the short distance from the National Railway Museum to York Railway Station, the two Victorian siblings fell fast asleep. Back in time on the canal, supper was over, and the pots were all washed and put away. This was the time Alicia had begun to love most. The family all together around the fire, talking about their day. Usually, it was Albert who started the proceedings, but this time it was Jamie, telling everyone about his great discovery. Everyone listened intently as he told them about the moldings under the floor and the bricked-up furnace. "Why have they bricked up the furnace?" asked Albert. "It seems they couldn't get the iron right, so rather than dismantle it, they bricked it up to preserve it until someone came up with an answer. But then they found it was cheaper to have it done elsewhere. Now I have been making notes for John. It's very simple instructions for what I have been doing this week, so he knows who is who when he gets there. Alf Wheelwright will be able to read them to him." "Right then, lad. Let me tell you my news. Your sister did the barge almost single-handedly today. In fact, the only thing she didn't do was tend to Toby," enthused Albert. Everyone in the cabin began to clap, so Alicia stood up and gave them a theatrical curtsy. "Why, thank you all," she said. The loudest and the longest applause came from her very proud brother. "Oh, well done, Alicia. Let me give you a hug." The two siblings hugged each other tightly. Alicia was proud of her achievement, but her heart swelled at the love she was feeling from her brother. Jamie smiled and gave his sister a kiss on the cheek, whispering in her ear, "Dad would be so proud of you right now. I do hope this isn't all a dream." Alicia squeezed his hand and said, "This is as real as it gets. I will be like this from now on." Jamie hugged her once more, much to the joy of Albert and Doris. Albert reached for his little squeeze box, and once again the sounds of laughter and singing could be heard from the hard-working barge family. Sunday dawned over the canal, and a day of rest for this particular week. "What happens on a Sunday?" asked Alicia. A day off, I reckon," announced Albert. "Good. I can catch up on my sewing. If anyone needs anything patching, let me have it," said Doris. "You could take Toby into the field so he can kick up his hind legs," Albert instructed young James. "No, let me," said Alicia. "I'd love to do that." "That'll mean James will just idle the day away, doing nothing of importance," said Doris. "It's called playing," said Alicia with a smile and a wink for young James. "Woohoo!" shrieked James as he flashed past everyone and skipped off the boat. "Playing indeed. At his age, you'll be making him soft," observed Albert. Alicia stood up, kissed Albert and Doris, waved at Jamie, and then went to find Toby. "What are you doing, lad?" asked Albert. "I am going to fulfill a dream, Albert, and take a walk around the Victorian Centre of Leeds," said Jamie. Placing his fat cap upon his head, he bid Albert and Doris a good day and embarked upon his adventure. Alicia had led Toby to an open field and led him off to run. Although Toby did not have a saddle, and she was definitely not dressed for riding, only having her dress and coat on, with no undergarments, she was determined to still try to ride Lightning's magnificent horse. She made a clicking sound with her mouth, and Toby's ears twisted in her direction. He then trotted over to where she stood. She stroked his face and remembered how lovingly beautiful these animals were. Toby gave a slight whinny as Alicia grasped his mane, and then she kicked her leg up high and jumped at the same time, straddling the horse. As her naked bottom landed on Toby's back, A cold shudder engulfed her. As her bum and the horse's back warmed to each other, both horse and rider relaxed. The slightest tap of her heel, and Toby began to trot. Under the old way of thinking, this animal and this girl would not have even been in the same field. Also, Alicia would be wearing thousands of pounds worth of designer riding clothes. The very thought that her pampered rear being in contact with a thoroughbred horse, never mind an old nag, would have been absurd. She giggled to herself as she now experienced bareback riding in every sense of the word, and had discovered it was pure fun. Her mind was full of what her old friends would think of her now. She was very giddy, and had it been summer and not winter, would have probably discarded what was indeed her entire wardrobe onto the ground as she rode. There were parts of Alicia that she was discovering and loving. She had spent a lot of time in the 19th century actually enjoying herself, and for the life of her, she couldn't remember the last time she was this happy. The first impressions of Victorian Leeds were that all the stone buildings were as black as coal. As Jamie walked along the calls, he made his way to Leeds Bridge and stood there taking in the sights. Horse-drawn carriages, elegantly dressed ladies and gentlemen, and tradesmen and young urchins could be seen in every direction. This was the first chance to view the bridge as it was before its rebuild. Yes, this was excitement indeed to the history graduate. As it had been all through this week and the 19th century, he spent a lot of his time coughing. 21st century lungs had long since not had to deal with coal smoke, dust, and smog, but that was a small price to pay for Jamie. He turned right and wandered up what he knew as Lower Briggate, and instead of a bridge going across, it was just a street with shops on either side. There was a throng of shoppers, even though it was Sunday. Shopkeepers shouted out their wares. Horses, carriages, and children seemed to make it all sound even louder than it was in his time. How could that be, without the buses, cars, and motorbikes? It was then he realized all around there was the sound of steam engines. He had heard it all the way down the canal, and could still hear it on Lower Briggate, but he just couldn't get used to it without the bridge across. He knew the Leeds Viaduct wasn't built until 1869, and all the steam locomotives would stop at Marsh Lane Station. He continued up Briggate, marveling at the old buildings, most of which had been long gone in the 21st century. Tudor buildings with their black Jacobean oak, and little shops and lending houses lined both sides of the poorly maintained road. One Tudor building in particular stood out from the rest. It was much grander than the others, and the sign above the doorway was bright and clean with the words Atkinson, Atkinson, and Dewhurst standing out. Jamie peered through the leaded window and saw an elderly gentleman sitting at a desk. For some reason, curiosity got the better of him, and he went inside. The elderly gentleman welcomed Jamie inside and said, "Hello again, Mr. Winters. Mr. Atkinson is waiting to see you." There must be some mistake. I was just curious as to what you do here. I don't have an appointment," said Jamie. "Mr. Winters, I'm pleased that you could make it here. I know your journey has been a strange one. Please, step into my office," said Atkinson. the only surviving member of the original company of accountants. Jamie followed the impeccably dressed man into his office. Atkinson sat at his desk. His clothes were not Victorian. They were from an earlier era, and not dissimilar to how people who prefer the Gothic culture back in his time dressed. He was quite masculine, and said in a deep voice, "I have the details of your account prepared, and a clerk who will devote his entire time to it. His name is John Smith, and he will be the liaison between us and your sister Alice." "My sister's name is Alicia," said Jamie. "Indeed so," said Atkinson. Jamie instinctively knew Alicia would understand, and said, "Thank you," as he raised up from his chair to leave. "Mr. Winters, you will have another journey to make when you return to your own time, so be prepared for when you are called. One more thing, Mr. Winters. Look after that sister of yours. She is a very special lady." Jamie left the strange accountancy building and decided that was enough to take in for one day, but his mind was working overtime. Who was the guy he had just met, and where would this other journey take him? And yes, his sister was turning into something special. Jamie turned back and headed for the barge, and decided to keep his weird meeting with the accountancy firm to himself for now. Down the canal, his sister was walking up the towpath, holding on to Toby's reins. Alicia was sporting a thoughtful expression. She had decided that the name Alicia didn't befit her new outlook on life. And Alice was such a beautiful name. On arriving back at the barge, she announced her decision to Albert and Doris that she was taking on the name of their daughter. "Well, you certainly aren't that horrible woman that arrived here last week, young lady. I can tell you that," said Albert. "Thank God," replied Alicia. "Come here, my girl," said Doris, taking a cloth from her apron pocket, pushing her finger into the cloth and licking the tip of it. She took hold of Alicia's chin and wiped away a spot of dirt from her cheek. This basic act of loving care made Alicia think of her mother again, and how pathetic she had been as a parent. Once her face was spot-free, she inquired, "Anyone for tea?" "Always ready for one of those, lass," agreed Albert. Alicia took the teapot, put a little water in it, swished it around, and then threw the old tea leaves into the canal. Showing she had been watching Doris, she put a little boiling water in the teapot and swirled it around again to warm the pot. She then proceeded to make the tea, just in time for Jamie's return, and the whole family settled in the twilight for another evening of family conversation. The talk, of course, was about horse riding and steam engines. Poor old Doris couldn't even get a word in. An uneventful Sunday in the 21st century was also drawing to a close. John and Alice had spent the day still recovering from the trip to York, and John in particular from his last few days at Armley Mills, continuing his training, although his trainer had no real idea how important that schooling was. Lee Coach just thought he had a very enthusiastic young would-be apprentice, so their Sunday had consisted of lounging about on couches, talking about John's experiences in the mills and at York. Freddy and Alice had spent most of the time arm in arm on the couch, listening. Alice, although very tired herself, went to her younger brother and and took his shoes off to make him comfortable. Freddy, in the meantime, was making a beverage in the kitchen when Alice walked in and said, "Freddy Chambers?" "Yes," he replied, looking slightly confused. I remember." "You remember what?" "I have heard your sweet name before," said a serious Alice. "How could you have possibly heard my name, Alice?" "A very distant memory," answered Alice as she reached up to give him a kiss on the cheek. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked. "There's nothing much to tell, only I know our paths have crossed before." "Do you mean you have known someone with the same name as me?" "I can't remember," she said, shaking her head, "but something tells me it was you." "If that is the case, then we will definitely meet again," said Freddy, with a reassuring smile. "Yes, we will. There will be nobody else for me when I get back, for I now believe I have already met you in my time. That's okay, for we will meet again." "And again," she said with a yawn. "Come on, Sleepy. Let's go to bed," said Freddy.